Greetings, everyone. In this week's Future Trends Forum, we give higher education a checkup. This is quite serious, although a little bit wry, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But our idea is to try to look at higher education and see how it's doing right now in 2025, where it's healthy, where it's not, where its strengths lie, where it needs improvement, what we can do to try to make the entire sector of colleges and universities more vibrant. Our guest is a terrific observer and analyst for this, Professor Robert Kelchen, and the conversation, I think, went in some great directions. I hope you'll enjoy. Please subscribe and leave some comments at the end. Well, I think we should begin. We now have the top of the hour. Then let me welcome everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see you here today. We have just a wonderful guest talking about higher education. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. We've been talking about the future of higher education for quite some time. We've been slicing and dicing it in different ways, including looking at higher education's institutions sociologically, but also looking at them financially to see how robust they are and where they might be headed. The person I'm about to bring on stage is someone that I absolutely adore. Professor Robert Kelchen is, for my money, one of the great observers of higher education. He is a keen-eyed observer, really rich with data. He deeply reflects on where things are going. And I can always trust him for an objective, ground-setting look at reality. And what I'd like to do today is to have him come in, metaphorically, a bit tongue-in-cheek, kind of as a doctor. We'll take higher education to him for a checkup and say, how are we doing? How are things going? What do we need to eat differently? How is our exercise? So for a checkup on higher education, let me bring to the stage Professor Robert Kelchen. Good afternoon, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, great. How about yourself?
I'm doing all right. Greetings from warm and sunny Knoxville, Tennessee.
Oh, enjoy that. Enjoy that as you have it. Robert, we ask people to introduce themselves on the forum in a special way. We ask them to describe what they're going to be working on for the next year. I'm curious, what are the big topics that are uppermost in mind for you, and what are the projects they'll be working on?
Oh gosh, there's a lot going on right now. My day job is as a department head, trying to manage things like ceiling falling through part of my department this week.
Oh.
So you have some of those minor things, and then looking at the bigger picture pieces. And I spent a lot of time looking at the financial viability of higher education, which my research on public higher education is looking at what are the different ways that states fund public higher education and what does that mean for students in colleges. And I get a lot of requests about the financial viability of higher ed, which is across both public and private colleges. So I'll be digging more into how do colleges respond when they face financial challenges, and then chasing two small children around the rest of the time. So there's never a dull moment.
Well, this is great work. Good luck literally keeping the ceiling up, and everything else except for the children is what we're here to ask you about. Friends, if you don't know Robert yet, you may have seen him because he's often quoted in journalism, but also on the bottom left of the screen, you should see a kind of tan-colored button. That'll take you to his blog, which is just solid, wonderful resource material. I really recommend it. So, Robert, looking ahead for the next year or two, how is American higher education doing? We've got about 4,000 colleges and universities. Maybe 2/3 of them are public, 1/3 private. How are we doing, Doctor?
So it is a really mixed bag. There are a couple hundred colleges doing really well right now. They are primarily the big public flagships, and probably about half the states are growing like crazy, don't have enough places to put students. Seems to be a small group of technically focused community colleges that are doing really well because they've done a great job building workforce partnerships and pipelines to high schools and employers. And then the wealthiest private colleges that have enough money that they can do basically whatever they want. Students are choosing those options, and regionally focused public and private colleges and quite a few community colleges are really struggling right now. Enrollment is not as bad as it could have been following this past year's FAFSA mess. But even if many colleges are getting the students they're expecting, they're not getting the tuition revenue they're expecting because they're having to provide more financial aid to get students. Plus, operating costs are rising quickly. Things like deferred maintenance that we're talking about in the chat, covering healthcare, making up some lost employee salaries. So those sorts of things are really driving the rising costs. Revenue isn't rising as quickly for most colleges. So it's a financial challenge for probably 85 to 90% of colleges out there right now.
85 to 90%. Man, that is a solid supermajority of all of this. Friends, I'm going to ask Robert another question or two, but then it's going to be over to you for your thoughts and your questions. So as we're talking, try to keep in mind what you'd like to learn more about and what ideas that we'd like us to dwell more on, or topics that we haven't yet touched on when it comes to the health of higher education. Just really quickly, just as a kind of table of contents view, what's causing this? What's causing this 85 to 90% being financially challenged? I mean, is it can't just be state funding patterns? Demographics haven't really bitten yet. What are the reasons for this?
State funding in most states has been pretty good since the start of the pandemic. There have been a number of states, especially in the Northeast, where that is not the case. Mm-hmm. They have long-standing budget deficits, and they're starting to make substantial cuts in higher ed. But most of the country, state funding has been okay to this point, although with this upcoming legislative cycle, I think that's starting to change in many states as state tax revenue starts to flatline. So it's not as much on the state funding piece, mm-hmm. but for many colleges, tuition revenue is a challenge, that they don't have the market power to increase tuition. And for public colleges in roughly 30 states or so, they are limited in how much they can increase tuition anyway. So even if they had the ability to do so, people are willing to pay, the legislature or governing board won't let them increase tuition. But the biggest driver at this point has been on the expenditure side. Mm-hmm. Roughly 70% of colleges' budgets are based on personnel. Mm-hmm. And the benefit side of personnel is getting much more expensive, with health insurance in particular. We've seen since the pandemic, and this is starting to slow now, the lower wage workers were getting pretty decent pay raises for a while. That strained institutional budgets. And then just the challenge of paying for maintenance in an era of inflation. Mm-hmm. Operating costs are rising faster than increases in revenue, and that's giving most colleges significant challenges.
Do you think, why do you think that, as one part of that, why do you think that escalating financial aid and the increasing discount rate is happening?
It's happening because enrollment is down substantially from where it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's largely flatlined the last 2 years or so, which is at least a decent sign. But for those colleges in particular that are recruiting from that pool of high school graduates, we've seen declining numbers of high school graduates in the parts of the country where there's the densest concentration of colleges and universities. Northeast and Midwest in particular. Yeah. We've seen that, and then the share of high school graduates going on to college is down from where it was a decade ago. And that means for the colleges chasing after that traditional market, fewer students, same number of colleges, and a sense of desperation among some colleges to hit their enrollment numbers. And sometimes that means that they'll get the student, but they won't get much in the way of revenue, right, because they've had to give substantial scholarships to get them.
Yeah. What's depressing that enrollment, do you think? I mean, what's making post-secondary education less appealing, less required than it used to be?
The share of high school graduates going to college ticked down from about 70% in the late 2010s. It got down as low as 60 or 61% 2 years ago. It's gone up just a little since then. Part of it was probably the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But it goes beyond that. The decrease started before the pandemic. Some of it is the economy's been fairly strong, so people have other options besides going to college. But also there are concerns about public trust. People are getting the message that college is way too expensive, college doesn't have value, and that's leading some to reconsider going. And that drop in the share of students going on to college is one of the factors why a good number of colleges are facing financial challenges.
Right there. As a couple of friends of mine say in one excellent book, enrollment equals revenue. And if you drop the enrollment and you stress the enrollment, you see how this goes.
But on the other hand, just because your college increases enrollment, it does not mean that they're actually increasing revenue.
Because the per student can be lower if you've got higher and higher discount rates.
Exactly. There are some small private colleges that enrollments look pretty good, but then suddenly they close because while they had the enrollment, they were not getting the tuition revenue. They did everything they could to meet enrollment numbers and just hoped the tuition revenue would come, but they gave it all away.
We've seen quite a few cases of that. In the chat, Steve Foster observes that young people have been steeped in relentless anti-intellectual messages on social media. Do you think this is it? Do you think social media is helping nibble at higher education's appeal?
I don't know if it's just social media, but there are just the broad messages out there that college isn't worth it. There's a billboard for a couple years on the interstate about 2 miles from campus here that said, "Avoid student debt, learn a trade."
Whoa. Right on the way to campus.
Yeah. And you can learn a trade through a college.
Yeah.
Or you can learn it through an apprenticeship, which is effectively college anyway. The key is that if students are getting a good apprenticeship, getting skills, getting on the path to a good wage job, that's okay if they don't go to college. But America doesn't have a lot of those tracks that provide the training people need to get to a good job without college.
Yeah.
So instead, people go do things like deliver Amazon packages. In the short term, it's not a bad hourly wage for, say, a 19-year-old, but opportunities for advancement are limited, and that's the challenge.
That's a good point. Steve, thank you for saying that. I thought you were going to refer to people who want to become social media influencers as alternatives to college. I have more questions, but I want to hold back on them right now because questions have started to flow in. We have one from a colleague of mine, John Henry Stites at Georgetown, and he asked a particular question about demographics. Let me put this up on the screen. How many institutions remain undergraduate only, not able to pursue continuing graduate education for older students?
There's still a decent share of institutions that are undergraduate only, but there are some colleges that have tried to expand online education for undergraduates, thinking some of the traditional residential colleges going after a new market. All the rage 10, 15 years ago was colleges, traditionally undergraduate focused, starting new graduate programs in an effort to increase enrollment. And that worked some, but the challenge there is that so many colleges have gotten into this market, many of them online. How do you get your name out there? And in certain parts of the country, like the Northeast, just going out for a drive, you see all the billboards for, here are new graduate programs. And it's hard for a new institution to break in. There is just so much competition from better resourced, more established peers.
I've been noticing seeing more and more billboard type ads in airports, which is really interesting.
Yes.
John Henry, it's a really good question. And friends, if you're new to the forum, what John Henry just did, that's a Q&A box question. So you just type that in and I put it on the screen. So if you have any questions like that, please just use the Q&A box to do so. We have a whole bunch of comments in the chat. Our friend from Colombia, Alba Aralmo, says she has the same feeling about social media. She's seen a lot of videos saying, stay out of debt, don't go to college. You can make a lot of money living off of social media or starting your own business. There's the message.
Yeah, fun story on that. When I was on Twitter back in the day, I got blocked by Dave Ramsey.
Well, that's a signal achievement. What
Yeah,
happened? What happened there?
I did an interview with Money Magazine about his advice on staying out of debt and basically pay your way through college. And for most people, that's not great advice.
Hmm.
If you have the ability to get through quicker and you take on a modest amount of debt, that's usually a good thing. But apparently, one of his handlers read the interview and just tried to block everyone who was quoted saying not great things about his strategies.
Oh, well, it's always good to make powerful enemies, I find. If you, at least for your reputation. Well, along those lines, if I can just build off of that, uh, to what extent is this now a partisan political thing? In the United States, this is Republicans tend to be much more critical of, more skeptical of higher education than Democrats and independents. Is how much of this enrollment dip, how much of this general ailment is simply a Republican thing?
That's a piece of it, but it's also a lot more complicated than that. Because, I mean, take for example the focus on college not having value. There's a lot of that on the right, but there's also a non trivial amount on the political left about people who are frustrated about student debt. So they're also saying college isn't worth it because I'm stuck with this debt. Now, there are certain segments of higher ed that are increasingly politicized, especially the more elite colleges. But we have seen this transformation over the last decade or so where previously a lot of the well-educated, affluent individuals voted Republican.
Hmm.
In the last decade, that has rapidly started to shift.
Hmm.
There's still broad support for community colleges in particular and for regional public institutions as well. But will that continue to hold? I think that's an open question.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm hoping to get to that last question a bit before we go today, but I want to make sure that we have time for more people with more questions. Here's one from the excellent James Schulman, who asked a question about foresight. So I tip my hat to you for that, James. Given what we see in West Virginia, for example, about sudden realizations of the need for cost reduction, what have you seen as examples of cost reductions carried out with planning and foresight?
You know, in West Virginia, that's a that's a really prominent example of Flagship University making quite a few cuts. That is not as sudden as some of the efforts that we've seen to cut costs,
Hmm.
where it can just be in the short term, we are just doing furloughs.
Hmm.
The Probably the ideal way, if you're looking to cut costs in the long term, it is going to involve personnel. And can you come up with a way that actually involves strategic planning and shared governance when you're looking at making program cuts? West Virginia did that to a very limited extent. They had to move relatively quickly, or at least they thought they had to move relatively quickly. Financially, they're not in great shape, but they're not in terrible shape. But one of the fundamental challenges that we face at traditional colleges and universities is if we want to involve shared governance in the process, it's a long and time-consuming process, in part because we're running a 12-month university on 9-month faculty
Hmm.
for whom service is not the priority for them because that's not what is incentivized.
Right.
So if colleges want to move fairly quickly on this and involve a broad range of perspectives, it's going to cost them some money in order to compensate people for that work.
Hmm. Hmm. Are you familiar with Dickinson's academic program prioritization methodology?
I've seen a little bit about that.
Yeah, his book on this is pretty clear, but for everybody else, this is a system where basically the ideal is the university leadership shares the financials with the entire university population, and then they go through a process of figuring out which programs are getting the most bang per buck in terms of enrollment and revenue. And then they sift that out, ideally, and find out the programs that are not, the programs that are doing the worst, that are losing money, and those are the programs that get to be reduced or lose resources, whereas the programs that are getting the most enrollment, bringing the most revenue, get more resources. Um, it's a strategy or a method that I've seen used many times so far.
And one very common method that's used to look at program cuts is how many graduates are you producing? That is not a great metric for efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are some units, some departments where they don't have a lot of graduates, but a lot of people take their courses. There are service departments, they may have minors, and their majors don't really demand separate classes. What I'm looking at as an academic administrator is I don't want to offer classes that are low enrolled. But if you can find a way to make relatively few majors work while having classes that are well enrolled, that's great. But that also takes a little bit more effort than just saying we're going to cut every program that graduates fewer than, say, 5 students a year.
It's crucial to figure out which metric you have. James, thank you for that excellent question. And for everybody, this is something I'd advise you to keep an eye out for. Whichever programs, whichever institutions are actually doing cost reductions well. We have another question from John Henry Stites, which is another forward-looking question, appropriately. And this is one that we've been talking about a great deal. How much will the upcoming demographic cliff just worsen the economic situation of most institutions?
The term demographic cliff gets used a lot, but it's really a gentle slope in most cases. That it's not like the number of high school graduates is going to drop 15% in 1 year, but it may end up dropping 15% over the course of 15 years. So I think that's an important thing. It's not all felt at once, but it is cumulative. And in the Northeast and Midwest in particular, that decline is already being felt. But that's one of 3 variables in the model. The other 2 are the participation rate of high school graduates, how many of what share go on to college, and then what about older students who have gone off to work for a while and maybe coming back to college. So you have those 3 different variables. And if you're focused solely on the 18-year-old high school graduate, you're much more affected by the demographic cliff. If you're focused mostly on 31-year-olds with 2 kids, the demographic cliff doesn't matter as much even in the medium term. But what matters there is the economy, because when the economy gets worse, more people tend to go to college to upskill. And the second piece is, what are you doing to try to go out and encourage people to go to college?
Well, to fall back to my cheeky metaphor of you as the doctor diagnosing higher education, how are we doing as a sector in terms of our communication, outreach, marketing, however you like to put it? How are we doing in terms of lobbying state governments for increased revenue? How are we doing with convincing high school students as well as adults to apply to our campuses? How is our communication doing?
I think we do a pretty good job of lobbying state governments in particular, because we know exactly who to lobby, and that's why we have lobbyists.
Okay. Ideally.
In terms of lobbying or accessing the general public, that gets a lot tougher, because that is a lot of one-on-one conversations with people who often their interactions with higher ed, they could be they had a friend or a family member go 10 years ago. It was a terrible experience. They're seeing media narrative about college being expensive. Or on the good side, they like the flagship university's football team. Now, the part of universities that do a great job of outreach are extension offices. Because they'll help you do things like grow a better tomato. And they're often in every county of a state. They have those connections. But how often do faculty get out there and talk with families, talk with potential students? And part of that is the incentive structure as well, that we aren't encouraged to do that when we evaluate people.
Maybe that's one thing to do moving forward, is to start incentivizing faculty to actually do that. We have a question coming in from Stephen Payne. Good to hear you, Stephen. And he asks, with negative perceptions of costs in higher education, have you seen or do you anticipate institutions making changes to prices or transparency of costs?
Yeah, we see some of that, especially among private colleges,
Mm.
where there have been a number of institutions that have these absurdly high sticker prices, say $50,000 a year, that maybe two students actually pay. Everyone else is getting a substantial discount. Now, the advantage of setting those high prices is you get to figure out basically exactly how much everyone can pay, charge them that amount. But on the other hand, that scares away quite a few students who have no idea how tuition discounting works. Because it's this weird thing that if you haven't gone to college, you have no idea what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you're starting to see some colleges just lower that sticker price. They might lower it to $25,000 a year and give out a lot less in scholarships with the goal of increasing enrollment. And the research on that suggests that it has some benefits in doing so. Now, on the other hand, for public colleges, because tuition is limited in so many states, in order to get revenue, colleges are trying to add on additional fees, different tuition charges by major, in order to get the revenue that they're looking for. In some cases, it's simply because they can. At business schools, for example, they'll charge more because people will pay for it. But then in other programs like nursing, that is just insanely expensive to operate. So they're trying to add fees on to help cover some of the costs that are unique to an expensive field like nursing.
It reminds me a bit of airlines, which have rolled out multiple charging points besides buying a ticket, for seats, for luggage, for this, for that. And in the airport world or in the airline world, this is considered a big success. That this has yielded them a lot of revenue. Do you think that? Do you think there's any way of explaining tuition discounting to people? So just to back up, I've been, among other things, tracking the most expensive in terms of sticker price college and universities in the U.S. And we now have a cluster that are in the upper 90s, as $95,000, $96,000 per year. And what I'm trying to anticipate is when the first one breaks six figures and it costs more than $100,000. Now, only a few people will actually pay that. But that's going to get a lot of attention. That's going to get a lot of media buzz when that happens. But I think almost nobody knows tuition discounting. Even many academics I talk to are unaware of their discount rate and how it functions. How can we better communicate that with people?
Yeah, it's just a challenge to communicate that prices are so different across individuals that colleges have to report something called the net price, which is that sticker price, full cost of attendance, tuition fees, living expenses, all those things, minus grant aid. And that should be posted somewhere prominent, but it's a challenge for people to understand that if you have lower income families, they're not getting on airplanes regularly anyway. So they don't see that same sort of differential pricing as well. It's just a challenge. How do you get good information out to people who have no experience with this and often don't have a lot of trust in higher education to take good care of them?
This is very hard. Stephen's question is a really good one. Stephen, about 12 years ago, I had an epiphany one night, and I realized that the medical sector in the United States and the higher education sector were about as equally opaque in their pricing. And then I got very depressed when I realized that. But is there? Well, this is something we need to keep in mind. We have another question coming in. This is from Jessica, and let me bring this question up on the screen. Is that point opportunity identified regarding faculty community, family engagement, something that can be part of the state lobbying? What higher education department is involved? What educator cares about policy? Here, I'll put that back up on the screen. So I think this is referring to your point about faculty talking to individuals about this.
Yeah, faculty can much more easily talk to the community than they can to legislators, because that is something it's usually expressly forbidden for public university employees to talk with legislators in order to try to lobby on things like funding. But going out talking to individual families about the value of college, sure, that's fine.
That's something we should probably see more of. Jessica actually just raised her hand to join us on stage. Let me see if I can bring her up here.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's good to.
Hello, Jessica.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome
Happy New Year.
aboard.
Thank
you
you.
too.
It's been a while.
Good to
I
see
was just curious about bringing those two pieces and how, if or they could overlap. So when you were talking about lobbying, I was like, oh, that's very interesting. I'm wondering, what are we lobbying for exactly, and what elements? And then you said this need about the community, because I've worked in user engagement and community engagement, and I've worked on for-profit learning organizations, which is interesting. Anyway, and I've worked in schools, et cetera, and on higher education as well at the University of Washington. So I was just trying to see if there's an overlap there, and what are we really lobbying for, and is this something that would fit into what we lobby for? Because I loved your point.
Yeah, we can recruit students. We can try to get just the public perception of higher education improved. And
right, I guess I'm trying to picture, what are we lobbying for? Because I don't know that zone. Is it just funds? And insert in the funds, of course, is that a line item that we could insert that's not in there yet?
within a state budget?
What you're talking about lobbying.
Yeah.
And then you talked about in the next sentence, you kind of, and the community engagement, which I agree, they're on the front lines. That's amazing. And you want more of that. And there's incentivizing. And so then it brought me right back to, okay, is that something, where's the do you work in the lobbying at all? Like, do you have a say in that? Because obviously your point is right, important. And I'm wondering if it translates over to the people who are lobbying technically on your university's behalf.
Well, sometimes they university lobbyists will ask for input and opinion on that, but that is usually held very tightly among senior leadership in terms of the right and the ability to lobby, because it is so politically complicated, and they don't want anyone going off message.
Right. It's more like, what are we lobbying for?
Yeah.
And that should reflect your needs and the university's needs.
Yeah, exactly. And
right.
I mean, yeah, the best thing I can do as a faculty member is just in my interactions with the public, just make it known that people at the university are doing good things. And then the hope is that those people will either go to college, or if push comes to shove, they'll try to nudge their legislators to support additional resources.
So there's no interaction between sort of the chancellor level and you're head of the department, right?
Yeah, not really. No, that is all chancellor higher up.
Wow. Thank you. Because that's to me, coming out of the user research world, right? And needs best design, and design isn't everything. You got to get to the users and get your insights, which you are, as well as the customers on the front lines. So I would imagine they would, so anyway, my father used to be the chancellor of the University of Maine for like 25 years, but he's passed now. But anyway, I asked that question and just in honor of him too. So thank you.
Well, it's a great question, Jessica, and thank you for joining us on stage. Stay warm.
Gold.
Now, everybody, if you're new to the forum, that is, as you could tell, an example of a video question. So if you'd like to join us on stage, just click the raised hand button. And both Jessica and Robert put proof to the lie that you don't have to have a beard to be on stage here in the forum. That was a really, really good question. Robert, in the chat, as you've seen, we're having a running discussion about transfer credit and also academic institutions recognizing life learning. Our good friend Mark Corbett Wilson is writing about this. So is our friend Stephen Ehrman. We're getting some back and forth about this, and I'm just wondering if what you think about this is a greater recognition of lifelong learning by academic institutions. Is that something that will help make us healthier? Is there a way to do this, or is this something which is already taken care of?
I think it's something where higher education is slowly improving on recognizing transfer credits, prior learning. The wealthiest institutions, by and large, are not doing this because they have the market power to say you have to take every single class here.
Mm-hmm.
But for colleges that are seeking to get students, one way to make this easier is reducing the time, reducing the price tag. So if they can recognize what's going on already, that gives them the opportunity to potentially attract students who otherwise wouldn't come. Now, the challenge with this from a business model perspective is transfer credits, prior learning tend to be more for introductory or early program courses.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones that tend to be less expensive for colleges to teach.
Mm.
So you're giving up essentially more of your so-called profit margin when you shift students more into the higher level classes, smaller class sizes taught more by full-time faculty.
Mm-hmm.
But are you still getting revenue from the students that you otherwise would not by doing this? Yes. And for mission-driven institutions, are you serving the public good by helping a student get, say, the other 60% of the way across the finish line? And the answer there, again, is also yes.
So, I mean, this is another way for colleges to become healthier, is to follow Mark Corbett Wilson's advice, like most people should do most of the time. Thank you for that, and not just Mark, of course, but everyone who's participating in that conversation. Steve Ehrman and Michelle Dunbar. Thank you for doing that, for mentioning Braille. Friends, we have the floor is open for more questions, and if you don't ask them, I will ask questions, and nobody wants that to happen. But in order to spur you on, let me ask you the first of some forward-looking questions. What do you expect might be the impact of the new Trump administration on higher education over the next year or so? I mean, do you foresee repeats of some of the moves that he made in his first term, like the huge support grant for universities during COVID, or trying to aid HBCUs, or will he do the opposite? Will he follow DeSantis and trying to punish higher education with changing accreditation or imposing or elevating an endowment tax? What should we expect from this new presidency?
The first thing is the campaign platform included getting rid of the Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
I don't expect that because that takes going through Congress. Republicans have such a narrow majority in the House and a lot of other priorities. I don't think they're going to spend a lot of time and political capital on something like that. Other Republican administrations have said the same thing for decades. None of them have managed to be successful on that. I think that the so-called elite colleges are going to be in the crosshairs. The endowment tax may end up getting expanded to cover more private nonprofit colleges and maybe even some public colleges. But I think one of the biggest political successes for Republicans over the last couple of years was the series of House hearings bringing in presidents from various selective colleges. Those really fired up the Republican base. They got attention. They got presidents out of office. Those are going to continue. And then I think something's probably going to happen restricting immigration, which will probably also affect international students. Beyond that, I don't think we have a great idea of what's going to come at this point because there have been a lot of things said and we're not quite sure what's going to be the priority, especially in a Congress that can struggle to get major legislation done given a narrow majority.
Well, that's an interesting problem.
And then another restriction that wasn't in place during the previous Trump administration was the Supreme Court decision last year, the Bright-Loper decision, that reined in executive power. So now executive agencies can't issue regulations in the same way that they had previously. And that makes it harder for the administration to take action without going through Congress, although they still may try to either score political points or hope they get a decision from a favorable judge.
I'm curious about a possible two cultures split. when I read Republican think tank papers and commentary and the 2024 platform and other documents, it seems like on the one hand the Republican Party is very, very pro science and technology. They're constantly talking about how the U.S. has to maintain a competitive edge and we need more investment in sciences and that needs to be transparent and so forth. And at the same time, they're very, very critical of programs, pedagogies, and people who are usually in the humanities or the non-quantitatively intensive social sciences. Um, do you think this impression is going to prove accurate, that we will see a kind of, Republicans pushing to support one thing, but then pushing to reduce another?
I think that's possible, and there's a big split among the current Republican Party as well in what they're looking for in science and technology, and also for something like immigration.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big split between the Steve
Yeah.
Bannons of the world who
Yeah.
do not want immigration, period, and the Elon Musks who want it for very high skilled positions which benefit their companies. And this has a threat, this has a possibility just to consume the right for several years.
I've been wondering about that myself. The Republican Party has those two different competing interests. I mean, they have business people, generally speaking, who want to have lower wage labor, or they want to have the H-1B visa people who are more highly skilled. And then you have the law and order, et cetera, population that wants to reduce that. We have more questions coming in, Robert, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask. And we have our friend from Northeastern who wants to ask a question on stage. Let me bring Charles Finley up. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
Great, you?
Oh, very well. Now that we see you, or that we hear you, your camera seems to be off. Well, don't fuss about it right now. We can hear your voice, and that's a very important thing. And you can ask your question.
Okay, let's see.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that does it.
Hey.
Yeah, the big question is about unionization, because at least in the New England area, there have been several big wins for different groups, and I'm just wondering how that factors into the cost of operation that you've been talking about. If that trend continues, will it have any significant effect or not?
Great question.
In general, I think college leaders view unions as the likelihood of rising costs. And we've seen a few examples of this, especially about graduate student unions and stipends increasing pretty rapidly. But also we're in a period where inflation could very well go back up.
Mm-hmm.
And that means in the medium term, union contracts could actually lock in employees at well below inflation pay increases. And then for faculty and graduate students at private colleges, they're going to have a difficult time unionizing because under the Trump administration, it's pretty likely that the National Labor Relations Board will take a pretty dim view of unionization. At public colleges, that's a different story because that's at the state, that's controlled by states.
Inflation just went up again just this week. I just shared a data point about that from CPI, which is keeping inflation stubbornly high.
Yeah.
Do you, Charles, do you think that colleges and universities are going to try to squelch union drives because of this new National Labor Relations Board and new administration?
That has always been the case. So
Yeah,
I don't,
more than usual.
I don't know. It's difficult to predict in that regard, but I know the messaging whenever certain institutions around the New England area were unionizing, and the messaging was very clear. And obviously, the university administrations did not support unionization for obvious reasons. So, but who knows what will happen? And the point about inflation certainly is a valid one. If it's locked into a certain rate or percentage of increase over a period of time rather than a flat rate, then obviously it's going to have an impact, and not a significant impact as one would expect.
Well, this is a key point. Thank you, Charles. Thank you very much. And please stay warm where you are.
I am.
Okay. Take care. Robert, in the chat, Mark Corbett Wilson raises a question, and it points in a direction that we haven't yet taken our conversation. A very, very typical argument to be made is that college and university costs have risen because of administration. And when people say the term administration, they either refer to all non-student, non-faculty costs, president down through custodians, or they're referring to senior administration, where the compensation is more lavish. This goes back to Ginsburg's book, The Fall of the Faculty, for example, where the term administrative bloat. Is there truth to that? Are we seeing the staff sector of higher education become predominant, and as a result driving up costs, and as a result scaring away enrollment?
The staff sector in higher education has certainly grown. Some of that is staff do jobs that faculty members used to do, and there can be perfectly good reasons for that, like academic advising.
Yeah.
That used to be primarily done by the faculty. Now it's been largely professionalized, which you can make a case is a good thing because they're paid less than faculty, and I think most of us would say that they probably give on average higher quality advice about the nuts and bolts of course registration, because faculty often aren't very good at that. You lose things when you're say a junior or a senior trying to talk something to a professor, but in general you can say that's probably not a bad thing. But then there are other functions that are listed under university budgets but aren't really tied directly to at least undergraduate education. There's a study that came out that Stanford had more administrators than students, and that's because they counted a whole bunch of research scientists as administrators.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, especially for Stanford, that's a quite an accounting mistake there.
Yes, the research public service missions, those are largely separate from instruction, so that's not really as relevant. In terms of the senior administrators, their pay is definitely going up fairly quickly, but the rationale for that is, first, it can be hard to find good leaders, and second, your shelf life as a president, for example, is getting to be very short.
Yeah.
Because it is an increasingly miserable job across much of higher education. If you're going to take a new job and you think you'll get fired, you'll probably demand a pretty good salary. There are 3 jobs in higher ed where they're all kind of similar in a way. A big-time athletic coach, a president, and your director of admissions or enrollment management. It's easy to see the numbers for wins and losses. They're high profile, and the shelf life is pretty short for those exact reasons.
That's a great trio to keep in mind. Thank you for that. That's excellent. We have another video question coming in, also from the Northeast, from Nancy Smythe, who is a professor and associate dean at the University of Buffalo. And let's see if we can bring her up on stage. Hello, Professor Smythe.
Hi. Actually, it's Smith with a Y, just to be difficult. But
sorry, Dean Smith. Sorry.
That's okay. I apologize because I joined late, and it's possible this came up earlier, but with the increase of costs that have been pushed to higher ed, and what I see is the increase in corporatization of higher ed, I see more and more faculty getting disgusted with the role of faculty. They feel like they are more often treated as widgets. They don't have a lot of support for things like purchasing and travel. They have to do all of this now with forms, in front of computers, and then they get something wrong, it comes back to them. And we're losing them to the private sector. They're making more money in the private sector, and they're feeling like they have less creativity in higher ed than they did. And I'm in social work, which is a professional school, social sciences, which actually has a shortage of faculty. But I see this being discussed by faculty, on social media across a variety of disciplines. That the reasons why they took these jobs, they feel like they're losing that. There's been this emphasis on certain types of research that bring in money, which may or may not match with their interests. And, they didn't take these lower paying positions because, for money, but they took it for, increased autonomy and creativity. And that feels like that's going away with corporatization. And I would say even I was dean of our school for 17 years. And part of why I left the job is I felt that in a research university, we had ceased becoming the senior leadership. Even there'd been this whole other layer, put up above us. And we were rarely having as much room for that kind of innovation. So I'm curious if those are any things that other people have seen, if those are trends.
Yeah, there's certainly more centralization across almost every college and university in the country. A lot of that is just new computerized systems to do things. Some of it is liability reasons. But I'm a department head, so I'm a mid-level academic administrator, and the amount of time I spend signing, re-signing forms is substantial. But my philosophy as a department head also is, how do I try to shield my faculty from as much of this as possible and provide support to my staff to do the same?
And you think you're successful at that? Because we've tried to stop that, but the university insists on centralizing to the point that you have to go back to that user anyway repeated times to bother them. And I'm wondering if you've been more successful than we have.
Some, yes. My philosophy may also differ a little bit about something like travel. I expect faculty to learn our new travel system because they're not going to save any time telling an admin to do it, because with the 17 back and forths it takes. So there are some things I do expect faculty, including myself, to learn. And that gives staff and me time to support faculty on the other things that would otherwise just be a lot more obnoxious.
Yeah, and I think if travel stayed the same, people would be fine with that. But the rules keep changing based upon other changes in centralization. So that's partly where people are feeling like the work that's been pushed out to them is more and more that kind of clerical work that ties up a lot of time and back and forth. And, they're walking away. They're saying, I'd rather be an entrepreneur. I'd rather work for an entrepreneurial group. I'd rather do something like that than sit here, doing the things that are not the reasons I chose this. I mean, it's not like they're getting more time to work with students. That's not what I'm hearing from folks, though.
Yeah, we are on week 2 here of a brand new enterprise software system.
There you go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What did you shift to?
We shifted from an old SAP system from the 80s to Oracle.
Wow, that's a big step.
Yes.
Oh, good luck. Dean Smith, thank you so much. By the way, one of my students, an undergrad student, went on to do graduate history work at Buffalo, and he had a great experience.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
I just wanted to share that. Friends, we're almost out of time, and I want to jump in with my last question, and this is a kind of existential question. Do you think, Robert, that we should be expecting to see a range of more program staff cuts, institutional mergers, and institutional closures, leading to either a plateau in the total capacity of higher education, or are we going to be looking at the whole thing shrinking a bit?
Capacity means something different now with online, that you can scale up capacity pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But in terms of the number of institutions, I think we are going to see more. We're going to see more closures and mergers, but not as many as people would expect because of things like program cuts and layoffs, or just not filling positions. I think colleges are realizing now that many of them are not going to grow their way out of issues, because it's a pretty tight space, especially with online education and so many players in that market, that they're looking at making cuts now so they can be more sustainable in the future. So I think college closures probably get more attention than they should, and program and department cuts get less.
That's something we should keep an eye out for. And Professor Kelchen, you can really help us with that because of your research and your work. I have to thank you very much for being with us for this hour. It's just been an absolute breath of clarity to be able to hear from all of your work on all of this. What's the best way for people to keep up with you? Should they follow your blog? He said,
Yeah.
pointing to the sign on the bottom left of the screen.
Yep, that's a good way. I'll drop my email address in the chat as well.
There we go.
And I write pieces a few times a year for the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I'm pretty easy to find.
Excellent. Well, in the meantime, thank you again. Please enjoy the sun that you've got there for right now at Knoxville, and watch out for those billboards.
All right, will do.
And above all, take care of those two little kids. Enjoy them.
Yes, thank you.
Take care, Robert. But don't go away, everybody else. Let me just point to where we're headed next, and let me also thank everybody for their really, really good questions. This has been very, very rich. If you'd like to keep talking about these questions, and be it questions of transfer credit, questions of program cuts, be it questions of pricing clarity, we can keep this discussion going on social media. Let's use the hashtag FTTE, and you can find a whole bunch of these at Twitter, LinkedIn, Mastodon, Threads, and Blue Sky. If you'd like to look into our previous sessions, including the ones looking at specifically the economic health of higher education, our archive is available at tinyurl.com/FDF archive. If you'd like to look ahead to our other topics, we've got a whole bunch of them coming up, from reforming grading to climate justice, World Futures Day, AI, free speech, high school graduates, teaching and learning centers, and more. Just head to the Future Trends Forum website at forum.futureofeducation.us. In the meantime, thank you again for your excellent, thoughtful questions. I think this has been a really, really productive conversation. I hope everybody is well. Those of you who are in the north, please stay warm. If any of you are in the Southern California area, please be safe. Until next time, take care, everybody, and we'll see you online. Bye-bye.